Welcome back to Quest for 2. Today let's talk about a new card from Whispers in the Well. This bad boy. That's right, Hades looking for a deal. It's been about a month into the release of Whispers in the Well, and with several tournaments behind us, I think it's fair to say Hades is a pretty good card. Some think it's absolutely broken.
No. To me, this card is absolutely broken.
We have top players doing well with 4 copies of Hades in their purple, steel and blurple lists. Yet prior to the release of the card, some still considered it overhyped. So, why the disconnect? Fundamentally, it's because Hades' ability is one of the most difficult to evaluate in card games. Abilities that give your opponents choices. Having played with Hades quite a bit, let's now take a deeper dive into what actually makes Hades good and in what situations Hades is good in. First, let's look at Hades' rate, which basically means evaluating how much we're getting at the ink cost compared to other cards of equivalent cost and similar effect. Let's get the obvious out of the way. A 5 cost for 3/4 Quest for 1 is fairly undersized, especially since it dies to be hurled as Thunderbolt, which is likely going to be an important damage check in core constructed moving forward. Its size is comparable if other 5 drops with pretty good come into play abilities like Belle, Donald Duck or Ursula, so Hades' effect better be good to justify such a small body. And boy is Hades' effect a doozy. When you play Hades, you choose an opposing character, and your opponent decides whether or not to let you draw 2 cards, or they lose that opposing character. Let's take both outcomes one by one. Firstly, a 5 cost 3/4 that draws 2 cards is pretty nuts. I mean, people were playing Finders Keepers in the Set 9 Fabled metagame, and Hades is just better. Assuming you draw 2 every time with Hades, since you develop a 3/4 body along with drawing 2, it's almost like drawing 3 like Finders Keepers and playing one of the cards for free. Its other outcome is a 5 cost 3/4 remove an opposing character of your choice, which is also insane. If it always did this, then it'll be better than its bigger brother, Hades Infernal Schemer. So I think we can agree, if Hades was always either one of the 2 possible options, it would be an incredibly rated card, especially since it only costs 5. But there's the rub with Hades. It doesn't do either thing all of the time. Whenever you play Hades, you always get the worst of the 2 options because your opponent gets to choose. So that brings us to the nub of the issue. How good are cards that give your opponents choices? Historically, opponent choice cards have not been great. We had Unfortunate Situation, which never saw any competitive play because your opponent would just choose the worst character on the board to take the 4 damage, not worth the 4 ink. Even a good rate discard song like Sudden Chill never saw any play outside of being paired with an enabler like Prince John, because by itself, you spend 2 ink, your opponent discards the loudest card in their hand, continues playing the game, just not worth spending the card and the 2 ink for that effect. The best of the lot is probably Mother Gothel Unwavering Schemer, but that's because it has a great smaller shift target, it's huge, and when you play it and your opponent chooses something to return, it swings the tempo of the board largely in your favour. Even then, if your opponent has a great target to return like a Hades or a Dog, it's not that good, which is why it hasn't seen that much play even in the current core constructed format. So, what makes Hades different from its predecessors and actually good? The TLDR is that it doesn't really matter what your opponent chooses, because the effect that you get in either case is so advantageous that it's worth the 5 ink cost. You draw 2 cards, great. You remove a character that you want to remove, also great. The reason why Hades is amazing is because the rate on the card, no matter the opponent's choice, is obscenely high. Add on the fact that it's inkable, so in situations where it's not good to play, you can always play it as ink, just makes Hades so really good.
This card is absolutely broken.
But is that the end of the story for Hades? Well, no. Having played with the card quite a bit at this point, I think that there are definitely gameplay situations, and as such, decks that find themselves in these gameplay situations very often, where Hades is less than desirable. So let's think about it a bit more. A common adage you may have heard card game players use to describe cards like Hades is good when you're ahead, but bad when you're behind. That means that Hades is a card that helps you seal off games that you're already winning, but may not help you get back into games that you are losing. This idea harkens to a commonly known framework for evaluating cards called Quadrant theory. In Quadrant theory, we evaluate cards on 4 axes, or I guess 4 quadrants, basically 4 situations that are likely to arise in a game. Firstly, the developing stages of a game. Secondly, where the game state is equal. Thirdly, when you are ahead. And fourthly, when you are behind. To give credit, I learned this concept years ago from a longtime Magic commentator Marshall Sutcliffe, who is also the host of one of my favourite Magic podcasts called Limited Resources, dedicated to discussing draft and sealed Magic. Marshall wrote a great article on this concept back in the day in the context of Magic, which I've linked in the comments if you are interested. For our purposes, I'll port this concept of Quadrant theory over into Lorcana to analyze Hades. I'll also give some examples from in-game situations that happened in recent pro events where Hades was played. So first, let's evaluate Hades during the developing stages of the game. These are the early turns where players are playing cards on curve on turns 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and are basically jockeying for board position. Let's assume Hades is played on the earliest turn it can. How good is Hades on turn 5? If you think about it, playing Hades on turn 5 is pretty good, right? At that point, the lore total of your opponent is probably quite low, or at least as low as it's going to be. You play a 3-4 body that would likely be able to contest most of your opponent's characters because, they played it on turns 1 through 4, and you would have 2 to 3 cards in your hand at that point. So no matter what your opponent picks, it will be a good outcome for you. Either they lose their best character on their board which you selected, their 4-drop or their 5-drop, which would bring you further ahead on board, or you draw 2 cards and refill your hand. Let's look at this in action from the recent Barcelona CCQ between Perez and Fontinha playing a purple steel mirror. It's coming to Perez's turn 5. She's slightly behind on board. She inks a Hades and plays a Hades, selecting her opponent's genie. No matter what Fontinha picks here, it's good for Perez. Either I draw 2 cards or I remove the 1 evasive quester on the board. He decides to let her draw 2, which is perfectly fine. The lore totals are low, she'll have plenty of time to deploy those resources, and the game goes on with her with 2 further cards in hand and a Hades on board that can pressure the Calhoun, the Palace Guard, and the Genie 3-4 that's on the board. I would, however, caveat that this is only true if the deck that you're playing against is roughly the same speed as yours. If you're playing a deck with Hades that's much slower than your opponent's and your opponent's able to deploy enough lore gaining threats that, turn 5 is almost the end of the game, then maybe at that point, Hades is just not that good. But let's talk about that more at a later quadrant when you're behind. For now, assuming that in the developing stages of the game, you're not yet in immediate danger of losing on lore, then Hades is a very good card to play on turn 5 and hence is very good at the developing stages of the game. So far so good for Hades in the developing stages, with a caveat that you're not in immediate danger of losing on turn 5. Let's now talk about where the game state is equal, or in other words, where there's parity. Where the game state is at parity, most commonly both players would either only have 2 or 3, maybe 1 character on the board. The lore totals are low to medium, say capping out at maybe around 10 to 12, and all characters are vaguely equivalent in size and on impact on the board. How does Hades fare here? Similar to in the developing stages of the game, playing Hades where the board is at parity is quite fantastic. Since the rate of the card is so high, both of the options would generally be very good. If they let you draw 2, then it's better than playing, Merlin Rabbit from sets past. And if they remove the character, it's like playing an early Hades Infernal Schemer. In that case, it's even better than Elsa 5th Spirit, which is also very good in her own right on board parity situations. Here's an example clip from the Barcelona CCQ as well, between Daniel Fernandez playing purple steel and Pierre Baudier playing blue steel. On Daniel's turn, you can see from his board, it's roughly even. Maybe the Jasmine is a fairly larger character than anything that Daniel has, but still, I would say more or less even. Daniel here inks and then plays a Hades targeting the Jasmine, and now Pierre goes into the tank thinking he doesn't even know which is the correct option, because again, there is kind of no good option here for Pierre. If he lets Daniel draw, then Daniel can refill his hand and gain more resources, but if he loses his Jasmine, his board becomes significantly weaker. The Jasmine is what's basically holding down the game state for Pierre at this point, so he's kind of in a tough spot. He decides to let Daniel draw, and Daniel then draws into Hild's Thunderbolt, which he sings with his Lexington to kill the Tipo, which will prevent Pierre from singing Beyond the Horizons with his character's next turn, which puts him very far ahead. But what about other kinds of parity? Say both players have 0 or 1 characters on the board and no one has any cards in hand and they're both essentially just top decking cards off the top of their deck. In this case, Hades will be pretty good to draw and play as well, right? If they have 1 character that, let's say, can't win the game next turn, because then we wouldn't be at parity, we will be at a game-losing situation, then they have a tough choice. They let you draw 2 and you have no cards in hand, so the 2 resources might be huge, or they remove their 1 character, give you your quester, which is more likely what they will choose, and you kinda, stabilize the board back. So in this case, Hades is pretty good as well. However, where the board is at parity but your opponent has one character that is significantly more important than anything else, something that's able to generate incremental value as the game goes on, say something like Clarabelle Light on her Hooves, or the latest Shere Khan, or the latest Madame Medusa, then in these cases, Hades is way less good. In these cases, your opponent will often let you draw the 2 cards, which sure is a decent outcome, but often these kind of high impact cards are able to generate more card advantage and also more tempo advantage on the board than those 2 cards that you drew will be able to get back because you have to spend ink and turns to play them. So in these cases, Hades is still decent, but way less good than if all the characters were roughly the same value or, of generally low value, just a ball of stats on the board. So all in all, where the game state is at parity, Hades is still pretty good, but we have to dock a few points because it's bad against high impact characters, especially Clarabelle Light on the Hooves. I'm looking at you. So next, let's look at the most obvious case. When you are a hit, how good exactly is Hades then? There's not even a need to sugarcoat it. Hades is insanely good when you're a hit. In fact, it gets better the more ahead you are in the game. But what does it mean to be a hit? Well, to put it simply, it means you are the one with the bigger board position, and you are the one who is in a position to quest with your characters because you're not going to lose your characters in value trades. And lastly, being a hit generally means that you're not in immediate danger of losing on lore. So in these situations where nothing bad is likely to happen to you on board, Hades is absolutely insane. No matter what your opponent chooses, either draw 2 or remove a character, you're just pulling so far ahead. There's a reason why some people would say Hades is good when you're ahead and bad when you're behind, but now we're focusing on good on the hit. Let's look at some examples. For our first example, let's go back to the match between Perez and Fontinia at a later point. It's Fontinia's turn to start, and we can look on the board, he's clearly dominating. His genie is free to quest because Perez is unable to challenge his genie, and Perez can't quest with her genie because he has the genie satisfied dragon and his own genie to take it out. He also has just more characters, and so is in a dominating board position. On his turn, he draws for turn, he inks a card, and then he just slams a Hades here, targeting the genie, and it's just absolutely insane. He adds another character to the board. Perez is put in a tough spot if I give him 2 cards, and by the way, he only has 1 card in hand at this point. He's happy enough to ink the Dumbo because he knows he's going to draw 2 here. And so now he gets to refill his hand, and because the board is in such a good state, he's happy to just quest out of his characters here because there's not much that Perez can do that would gain her value in any of the trades back. So in this spot, Hades was just absolutely nuts. Here's another example from the Barcelona CCQ in a match between Shokan on Amber Steel and Fernandez on Purple Steel. It's going to be Fernandez's turn. We can look on the board, and he clearly has Shokan completely dominated. His characters are just larger, and the lore totals are fairly low, so it's not like Shokan's in a position of kind of alpha questing for lethal here. So yeah, he's a hit. Way a hit. On Fernandez's turn, he inks and plays a Hades, targeting the lady. And again, similar, and this is a thing you've heard plenty of times at this point, Shokan's in a horrible position. If he lets him draw 2, he's gonna advance in resources, and if he doesn't, then he loses a character like he just did, and with the traits that happen, he's left with nothing left on board. Hades was just crazy. So yeah, enough said. 10,000 points to Hades in this situation. Look at the quote on top, good when you're ahead, bad when you're behind. Yeah, Hades is gonna be good when you're ahead, obviously. The reason why is because precisely when you're ahead is when Hades gives the opponent a choice when none of the choices are any good. But enough faffing about, let's get to the most important category, when you are behind. Why is it the most important? Well, in a card game like Lorcana, there will be situations where you are behind, especially when you are on the draw, and ideally you would like to have the cards in your deck be able to help you catch up from being behind to at least getting to a level board state. If a card sucks when you're losing and it's only good when you're winning, well then that's not a very good card at all, because you want the cards in your deck to be able to help you to get from losing to winning, and not just help you win positions that you are probably already won by playing everything else that you're playing. But there are many cases and degrees to which you can be losing in Lorcana. So let's get the obvious one out of the way. Your opponent has the board lead, they can quest for lethal next turn, and you cannot remove any lethal threat. How good is Hades here? Well, not very good. You played a 5-cost 3-4, and that 3-4 cannot challenge anything because Hades doesn't have rush. Your opponent is presenting lethal or maybe multiple lethal threats, so they are likely to pick the best outcome for them, most often to let you draw 2 cards. And because you spend 5 ink to play this body, you're not going to have a lot of ink to deploy the 2 cards that you have drawn in order to try and save the game. It's tough to find a situation where a player would actually play Hades on a losing board, but I managed to find one here in a match between DeRosa on Blurple and DKP on Seth Steele. It's DeRosa's turn, he has no cards in hand, he's facing down a lethal quest with 2 Vincenzos next turn. He draws a Hades, and since he has nothing better to do, he plays it. We can see that if DKP let him draw 2, it actually wouldn't do much here. After counting, DeRosa only has 4 ink left over after playing Hades, and there's not much that DeRosa could draw that could save him in this spot, maybe Into the Unknown, but that's pretty much the same thing as letting him bottom Hades, so might as well let him find it. It turns out DKP decides to bottom his Vincenzo, likely because he doesn't want to think about what combination of cards DeRosa could draw that could beat him here, or he doesn't want to eat an Into the Unknown and give an extra card to DeRosa. And in any event, he's questing up to 19 next turn anyway, and DeRosa will be put into the same situation again where he would need to deal with the existing Vincenzo on board. The point remains that if DKP had let DeRosa draw, it's quite unlikely that DeRosa would have been able to save this game from behind having played Hades. So, in those immediately losing board states, Hades will likely let your opponent draw 2, and not actually deal with the character because your opponent gets the choice. That's not very good to save the game, but is that necessarily terrible? Well, no. There are spots where playing a 5-cost 3-4 draw 2 might be able to get you to a position where you draw 2 cards that could be able to help save the game and eventually top deck enough to come back into the game. Like we just saw in the example with DeRosa and DKP, if DKP had let DeRosa draw, maybe DeRosa could have drawn into the Unknown to play on that turn to remove the exerted Vincenzo, and a Hades Infernal Schemer to then play on the other Vincenzo the following turn. He didn't let DeRosa draw, but that also means that DeRosa got exactly what he wanted, which is to remove the threat of him losing immediately the next turn. So actually, the way it played out, Hades not so bad. And that's only a case where you are immediately losing. What if you are behind, either on board or on law, but not definitely immediately going to lose the next turn? The thing about Hades is, the less behind you are, the better playing Hades gets. Let's look at a few examples. Here's a game between Montoro on Blurple and Barrera on Blue Steel. Montoro is clearly behind on board, but importantly his law total is pretty high at 12. And on board currently Barrera has no way to challenge Blurple's evasives. He then plays Hades and Barrera instantly lets him draw 2. Sure, that's not the outcome he would have wanted, but that's the outcome he's going to get. But is that necessarily that bad on his board state? No, it isn't. From what he draws, he can decide how he wants to play out the rest of this game. Does he want to try and remove Barrera's big threats, or does he go for a questing route and play evasives and just ignore Barrera altogether and hope Barrera doesn't have removal? If he draws Into the Unknown, Hades Infernal Schemer, Monstro, maybe even Hypnotic Strength, then he can decide, okay, I'm going to trade the board here and try and get back to board parity. If he doesn't draw any of them, he can then decide, I'm going to go for the racing on law game plan, play another evasive threat, and quest out and hope that you can't answer my board Barrera. As it turns out, he didn't, or is unlikely to have drawn any of the removal, and instead he just plays a genie, quests with his genie, and is now presenting his own lethal law threat over to Barrera. So what Hades did was it gave him the information that he needed to decide what is the best game plan to take from this point forward depending on what he draws from those 2 cards. Another thing this game shows is that when you are behind, playing Hades gets a lot better when you have a lot of ink, because you can spend the 5 ink and take the 2 cards your opponent is likely to give you and then still continue to deploy something that can impact the board. If he was only on 5 ink at this point, playing Hades here would not be very good, because he would not be able to do anything else on this turn that would be able to impact the board and get him closer to parity. Because he had 9 ink, he could afford to spend 5 to play Hades, see what are the 2 cards on top of his deck, and then decide on the best course from there. Here's another gameplay situation, yet again from the match between Perez and Fontinia, both on Purple Steel. We can see at this point, Perez is extremely far behind on board. She has no way to fight Fontinia's evasives, and here she just plays Hades targeting the genie. Fontinia goes deep into the tank, eventually decides to let her draw the 2 cards, and off the top of the deck, she draws the Strength of a Raging Fire, which she is able to sing with her Pete to kill off the genie. It helps level up the evasive sub-battle that they're having, and puts her much closer to reaching board parity. And this could only have been achieved because she had a Pete there that could sing Strength of a Raging Fire. So, as she is behind, but not yet crazy far behind, she still has characters on board, and importantly she has a 3-cost character that can sing that very important song. Hades letting her draw 2 cards actually help her catch back a hit. Contrast those earlier 2 scenarios to the one we have here, Again, a purple steel mirror between Fernandez and Voidart. Here, it's going to be Fernandez's turn. He is completely cooked on board. He has no evasives that can challenge the Dumbo and the Genie, and it's quite likely that if nothing changes, Voidart's going to win within the next 2 turns. He also only has 5 ink, which he then spends all of it to play Hades targeting Dumbo. Voidart goes into the tank to decide what to do, rightfully so, it's a fairly high leverage situation. He eventually decides to let Fernandez draw 2 cards, but he's unable to do anything further on this turn with those 2 cards that could meaningfully improve his board in any way. Voidart has free reign to do whatever he wants on the next turn and is likely going to win the game eventually because of the insurmountable board lead and also the Dumbo that Fernandez is unable to remove. So taking into account the range of situations where we can be behind, I think it's fair to say Hades gets a passing grade in this situation. It's certainly playable, but not fantastic. However, it does get better the more resources you have at your disposal on the turn that Hades is played. Well, at this point you must be thinking, since Hades is bad to passable when you're behind, and that's the most important category, I did say so myself earlier, that must mean Hades is not very good, right? Well, not really, because if you think about it, what other 5 drops could get you out of those board positions I showed you earlier to a point where you are on parity or almost winning? Almost none of them. Elsa Fifth Spirit? You can go back and look at the clips, I don't think that would work. Maybe Headless Horseman for one of those 2 situations? Sure. But Headless Horseman's like one of the best 5 drops in the game. Maybe Maui Hero to All, but that's not legal in core Constructed. And also, Maui Hero to All is one of the most dominant cards in Constructed in the history of Lorcana, was in almost every Ruby deck, and probably shouldn't have been printed. I think the best comparison for Hades is Bell Accomplished Mystic. Similar to Hades, it's best when there's already something else on board, in other words, something that already has damage on it, for it to transfer its damage. And where you are in a position where you're ahead, it's great. Where you're behind, it can help claw back into the game but not necessarily take it over. So if you're building your decks, perhaps that's the slot where you might want to consider, do I play Bell or do I play Hades? How about this? If you can think of another 5 drop that I've not mentioned up to this point that's as good as Hades when you're behind or worth discussing, you can leave it in the comments below. Engagement bait! So to conclude our analysis on Quadrant theory for Hades looking for a deal, I think it's safe to say that it's a very good card, notwithstanding that it gives your opponent a choice, because no matter their choice, the rate on Hades is so absurdly high, you're going to profit from it in most situations. It's also probably best in slot at 5 drop depending on what deck you're playing. It is best in decks that are built to stay ahead on board from the early turns, so for example Purple Steel or a low curve Ruby Amethyst, which are the competitive decks that we've been seeing Hades do well in. And it's also pretty good in decks that are able to have lots of ink to take advantage of and deploy the additional cards that Hades is likely to give you, because when you're behind, your opponent's likely to let you draw cards. I do hope you've learned something from this video, or enjoyed it at least, and if you do want to see more of this type of content, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks!